Welcome and thanks for joining us today. If you've been in these before, you are hopefully starting to recognize myself, Cassidy Dragonet, and my colleague here joining me, Ashley Blackham. We work in the Utah System of Higher Education, Office of the Commissioner. And we focus on financial aid for students, state aid, but also FAFSA completion efforts. So today we're going to be focusing, putting on our FAFSA hats. And so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. You all are here. Hopefully you remember for the prototype practice with case studies. So it's kind of our part three of the FAFSA bootcamp series. Today, we're going to be covering an intermediate case study. And so, well, if you're interested after today and joining in another um, level of case study, we'll be doing our final boot camp of the year, the advanced case study next week, September 30th at 11 a.m. So the topic will be a little bit more advanced than this. I think it will be covering determining who is a parent on the FAFSA when cases of divorce or separation happen. So it's a pretty common scenario, a little bit more advanced than some of the other questions that you might get around FAFSA. So if you're interested, we encourage you to register and join us. We also did a beginner case study last week. If you weren't able to join us live, feel free to review the recording and slides that are available, as well as our deep dive and account creation trainings that we did before that. If you're looking for even more practice or wanting to just maybe brainstorm some new ideas of what might be questions you'll encounter, there's 7 or 8 case studies total that are available aside from just the couple that we've selected to cover. There's a workbook of them that gives the answers as well. So you're not left hanging. But it's great practice. Feel free to review the full case study workbook that's available on our website. And that we hope helps everyone get ready for the launch of the 26-27 FAFSA that will be released by October 1st. However, something exciting that we shared out on our listserv last week that we learned from FSA is that they have opened up the 26-27 FAFSA for beta testing, open beta testing, I should say. So anyone should be able to review or submit a request to start their FAFSA and be approved to start the 26-27 FAFSA early. So I'm going to throw in the chat a link that gives a bit more information about that from FSA directly. And we did send that out on our FAFSA listserv. And if you didn't get that, but you're interested in receiving emails from us about either FAFSA, we have a FAFSA listserv where we send out information around FAFSA and state aid. But there's also one you can sign up for here as well about college access and admissions. So some of you may remember Dylan Cafferty. That's where his role has shifted to focusing on, and he sends out similar updates for admissions. And so feel free to fill this out if you don't already get our listserv. If you already get them, there's no need to fill that out again. All right, so a bit of information to start. Let's see, but just some key links and then we'll jump right in. Like I said, today we're going to be covering the intermediate case study. Ashley will throw in the chat some of the direct link to this case study we're going to cover today. Though if you have the full workbook open, it should be starting on page 11, excuse me, 31, not 11. And that's the case study that we'll be covering today. We'll be following the FAFSA prototype. And so here, Ashley can put this in the chat too, if you don't mind. But a direct link to the prototype. And then if you haven't logged in recently, you'll have to enter in this access code. But you can log in and then we'll use that tool to walk through the FAFSA. There is some limited functionality that it covers on that first page we'll talk about, but it's a great practice to get the look and feel of what the FAFSA is like for a student that's filling out the FAFSA. If you joined us last year, hopefully you've picked up on this already today that we're doing this a little bit differently. We're not doing breakout rooms, but we'll all be working together on one case study. So feel free as we work through I'll be pausing for points of discussion and questions, but if I'm covering something that you have a question on, please feel free to unmute and interrupt me. I very much welcome that. And if you would rather, you can also put a question in the chat. Ashley will be managing and making sure everyone can follow through. follow on up on the chat for questions there. But feel free, it's interactive. I welcome active participation. I think that's what's going to help us make a successful session today. So with all of that out on all of the initial things out of the way, here's our contact information. If you or students have other questions to contact us, fafsahelp@uc.edu or our phone number. We're always happy to troubleshoot or answer some of those FAFSA questions. There is a limit. There's some things that we won't be able to help with. We're only troubleshooting. If there's back-end questions about the FAFSA, you may have to contact them directly, but we can help you get connected with them as well, you or your students. So I'm going to pause sharing that screen and move over to this one. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with this case study. So I encourage you to have both the case study and the prototype open on your screen so you can follow along. Doing so does make the prototype look a little bit funny, so I'm only going to have one open at a time. But as we get started, today our focus is going to be on a student who has legal guardians or an unusual circumstance. So we're going to practice filing the FAFSA for a student who's classified as an independent student because of a legal guardianship or custody situation. This scenario provides practice in identifying independent student status, understanding documentation required for legal guardianship, and guiding families through the FAFSA when parental information is not required. So, a lot of times we focus on a dependent student situation where they are having to invite a parent. But there are situations for high school seniors where maybe they don't need their parents' information, and that's what we're helping cover today. So to get started, like I said before, go ahead and jump into the prototype and enter in the password. It should appear like this. This is the limitations that I talked about. It gives some information. It has been updated periodically to update any matches in the production form for improvements and bug fixes. But like I said, it may be still a little bit different than the final product that students are seeing. There's limited functionality, which we can point out as we go. The selection of school names and cities, for example, content don't include any from Utah, so it's limited there. There's lots of tool tips and other help resources that are embedded within the FAFSA that are not available in this form. So there's some things like that where students will have access to more information when in the live form, and then just some recommended usage that we'll be following today. So if you notice anything funny, maybe come back. It pops up at the top of the screen that it will show the prototype limitations option, and I'll point that out in a second. So if you're noticing something funny, maybe start there. But today we're going to choose Rhea Tran as our example student. And so we'll launch this user. This simulates the login process for logging into their FSA account. If you have questions about the studentaid.gov account creation process, like I said, I'd recommend going back and watching the training that we did a few weeks ago. But once they get into their account, for these students, once it launches officially on the 26-27 FAFSA by October 1st, it will appear this way. And so a student will want to start a new form when they're beginning. So here we're selecting as a student is starting the FAFSA. Something interesting we won't cover today. Like I said, we're covering an independent student, but if you're helping a parent who is providing information for their student's FAFSA, they're not starting their own form, but maybe the student invited them and they aren't following a link from an email, they can enter in the code here that they can get from the student's account. But like I said, today for Rhea, we're going to start as a student. When a student starts, they get prompted to review these informational videos, which are really helpful. We're not going to watch them today. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to review them, and definitely for students, especially if this is their first time and maybe they're a little bit nervous about the FAFSA and what it all means. These videos are really helpful. This first one just gives an overview of what is the FAFSA, what is this form that they're filling out, and what documents they might need. It gives an overview of contributors for the FAFSA, how to invite them, and who counts as a contributor. There's also this link down here that will give more information about who is considered a parent on the FAFSA. What to expect, particularly this covers what the consent and approval process looks like to allow the Department of Education in this FAFSA form to automatically retrieve their tax data from the IRS. There's more information on that page as well, but there's this helpful video to start. And then gives the student some tips for what happens after they complete the FAFSA. What can they expect next? So once students have reviewed all of that, they'll go ahead and start the form. And so if we have the prototype pulled up, we are kind of moving to that second page of student information. So up here at the top is the student's name, birthday, social security number, email address, and phone number. All of these are entered when a student creates their studentaid.gov account. If any of this needs to be updated, particularly email or phone number, if they want to update that contact information, they'll follow this link to their account settings and it'll direct them over to the page where they can update that and then they can return to their FAFSA. They'll also here be confirming their mailing address. And so if we go over to the case study, we see the student's name, birthday, social security number, email, and phone number all match up at the top, but the address needs to be adjusted. So I'll go ahead and update that here. All right, so once the student enters in their address, they click continue. Next is the student state of residence. And so this is where the student selects that they're currently residing, not necessarily while they're attending school. And so can anyone tell me Rhea's residency status? She's a resident of Utah, but when did she be, what is the date they enter here?
It'll be their birthday.
So that is a great answer for a student that's lived here their whole life. That would be when they would enter the date here. But for Rhea in this case study, it says that they moved to Utah in December of 2010, and in Utah, residency is established after living there for 12 consecutive months. So she established residency in December of 2011. So in this case, they're going to enter December of 2010. An important thing to note is that for purposes of tuition and resident tuition, that 1 year of residency is important for students to establish before, in this case, 2010, 2011 is much more than 1 year ago. But for a student maybe that moved here more recently, that's something worth noting. So they'll want to follow up with the admissions office at the institution to make sure they have all of the steps and understand what's required to qualify for that lower resident tuition if they don't have this longer period of residency in the state. So good answer. Next, we'll move on to the consent and approval page. Again, here at the top, it shows some of the prototype limitations and assumptions that happen. So this won't pop up for students on the live FAFSA. And one other thing I promised to point out and had not yet is up here, you'll notice at the top for demonstration purposes, it gives that ability to click on these links to see those limitations again if you notice something kind of funny. But what will happen, the student will see the summary part where it explains to them what's being retrieved. They're getting the 2024 tax information since this is the 26-27 FAFSA they're completing. It gives more information about what they're consenting and approving for, which I encourage students and families to review, especially if they have any questions or are unsure. But essentially, it's automatically retrieving their data from the IRS. So there's all of that information up there, as well as these frequently asked questions to go a little bit deeper for any parent or student that has questions. Down at the bottom, the students can select to either approve or decline at this automatic retrieval process. If a student selects decline, they won't be eligible for any federal student aid. So if they click decline, this pop-up will appear to let them know that if they don't agree to the terms on this page, that they're not eligible for any student aid, grants, or loans. So if a student's going to decline access, it may not even be worth it for them to complete the FAFSA. So this is just a warning to them that really, if you're selecting no here, you won't qualify for any federal aid. So we're going to go ahead and select approve. Here, it's simulating that it's retrieving that information from the IRS. If it doesn't automatically retrieve, there'll be a different error message here with more information for the student. But in this case, it did retrieve it successfully. Nothing is being saved. So, nothing got actually retrieved, but the process here is generally this quick. It's really not a long process that a family or student is sitting there waiting for the data to be retrieved. It's that quick. So they'll click continue, and then the student moves into the personal circumstances section. And this is where they'll answer some more questions, particularly about their living situation and parent information. So this is kind of where it gets into where we'll see some distinction for Rhea. So the student's status, as we can see in the case study instructions, they are single, never married. This is another good page I like to point out. Not only does it have the FAFSA form year listed up here, but it also mentions here these questions are about when the student begins the 26-27 school year. When the FAFSA opens, the 25-26 FAFSA will still be open for any student who's currently enrolled in school. So a lot of times we see students accidentally filling out the wrong form. So these questions hopefully are a good if they're reading it carefully, a good note or reminder to students that they want to be filling it out for the 26-27 school year. For the 25-26 school year, they won't be in college. So, when we're reading the information in the case study, this is Rhea's first time attending college. Rhea isn't sure what they want to study, but is interested in starting at a technical college or a 2-year program. So, we'll list the student as a first year freshman. Any student who's graduating from high school and going into college for the first time should select first year freshmen, even if they took concurrent enrollment courses or completed their associate's degree. This is particularly helpful for identifying students for that first year scholarships and financial aid. So all students that are graduating high school should select first year freshmen for that question. And then it asks if they will already have their first bachelor's degree for the when the student begins the 26-27 school year. And in this case, the answer is no. So now we're in the student personal circumstances section. This I'm going to refer us back to the background information that we had kind of skipped over. So I'm going to pause and read through it. It will help us answer these questions that are listed here. Rhea is a high school senior, who uses they, them pronouns. Their mother died when they were an infant, and they lived with their father until fifth grade. After their father received a 25-year life prison sentence, the court appointed Rhea's grandparents as their legal guardians. Rhea has lived with their grandparents ever since. So, when we come back over to these personal circumstance questions, the student is currently serving on active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces for purposes other than training. That one doesn't apply. And we can assume if it's not in the background information that it doesn't apply. The student is a U.S. veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. The answer is no. The student has children or other people excluding their spouse who live with them and receive more than half of their support from the student now and between July 1st, 2026 and June 30th, 2027. The answer is no in this case. At any time since the student turned 13, they were an orphan, not living with a biological or adoptive parent. That's not the case in this scenario. At any time was the student, after the student turned 13, were they a ward of the court, or were they in foster care? The next two, the answer to those two is no. The student is or was a legally emancipated minor as determined by the court in their state. That one's also no. And finally, this last one is where I think is interesting for us in this case study. The student is or was in a legal guardianship with someone other than their parent or step parent as determined by the court in their state of residence. So for this scenario, we know that Rhea has been, their grandparents have been appointed their legal guardians. So we're going to select yes for this one, but there are a couple of links that I want to share with you so that you have them for future reference because this is a little bit of a trickier situation than you might think. But for cases of legal guardianship is different than custody. So here, this gives some more information about legal guardianship as defined by FSA. But there's also this other helpful document that FSA produced, and particularly in the emancipation or legal guardianship section of this document, it defines that, or it calls that out specifically that if the student is The court papers have to say that the student has legal or that there's guardianship that's been granted, not custody. Custody would be a different situation. They wouldn't select yes to this question. So in this case, where we learned in the case study that the student has legal guardians, we would select yes here. It also gives this pop-up down here that legal guardianship does not include parents, even if they were appointed by a court to be your guardian. Um, so are there any questions on this section before we move to the next set of questions? Okay, so Ray will click continue. There's questions about homelessness at any time on or after July 1st, 2025. Was the student unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness? If we go back over to the case study and review the background information, the answer here is no. So that's when it pops up here that based on their answers, they're an independent student, and this means that they don't have to answer financial information about their parents' income on the FAFSA form. So we'll click continue. Next, it moves into demographic information about the student. This information at the top might be useful for students in noting that the information, the answers they provide here do not impact their eligibility for federal aid. It's not used in any aid calculations, and it is not shared with any of the schools that the student applies to or selects to send their FAFSA information to. These questions or the answers to these questions are not sent. So the student does have to select an answer here. But like I said, they don't impact their eligibility. So the answer is up to you as you're working through this. For the race ethnicity, the student, if they select one of these options, is able to see additional subcategories that they can select to best describe themselves. Or in this case, they can answer prefer not to answer. In this scenario, Rhea is a US citizen, so we can select that. The parent education information. Let's move over back to the case study. Can anyone remind me, did either of the students' parents attend or complete college?
I think it's neither attended.
Thanks, Ashley.
Mhm.
Yeah, so in the case study, I think Ashley's right. It said neither parent attended college. So we'll select that there. That kind of helps the institutions identify first generation students. Was the parent killed in the line of duty while serving on active duty as a member of the U.S. Armed Forces on or after the events of 9/11 or performing official duties as a public safety officer? And it gives some more information about what public safety officer careers include. So we'll select no here. Moving to the student high school completion status, another cue for students if to remember if they're filling out the right form at the beginning of the 25-26 school year. If you're helping high school seniors, they don't have any of these. And so in this case, Rhea will be completing and graduating their high school diploma during this current school year. So at the start of the 26-27 school year, they'll have their high school diploma. All right, so now we're moving into the student high school information. As a reminder, there is the limitations of this prototype. So the school that we are going to select does not exist, but your school or the student school should pop up here. So they'll start by entering in their state that they're from, the location, the city that their high school is in, and then they can even enter in their high school here for to be a little bit more specific. and then click search, and the option will appear down here. They can add their school manually if it doesn't appear in the list, though most high schools should. The other thing I'll note here is it's really important that students are selecting the correct school. When we share out FAFSA completion data, that comes directly from FSA, and they're relying on the information here that's input from students to be able to identify how many students from each high school completed the FAFSA. So if you have a similar name to another school, and the students are not selecting that, then that could cause the numbers to be off a little bit. So Rhea will select their high school and click continue. This information just, again, make sure that they're selecting the correct high school. That gives them the option to edit if they realize they selected the wrong one. They'll click continue. And then we've gotten to the finances section. This link here will help students and parents if they have that. As we can see, that's a limitation, but this is a link that gives more information about special financial circumstances to students if they have those questions. So while most of all of the tax information is retrieved automatically from the IRS, students still have to answer additional financials questions about benefits that they receive and about their assets that they currently have. So these questions are asking at any time during the 24-25 year, did the student or anyone in their family receive benefits from any of the following federal programs? When we look back over at the case study, and I am looking at my other screen, but I can be scrolling along to help folks too. But the federal benefits received listed is none. So the student here would scroll down and select none of these apply. Click continue, and then we get to the family size question. This information, the family size is automatically retrieved from tax information for the 2024 tax year, and that's what it describes here. So if that has changed, if maybe a new family member has joined them, a new child was welcomed into the family, or maybe one of their siblings is no longer has aged out or moved out of the house and doesn't receive support from a parent in a dependent situation, it's asking that information here. So we're going to select yes, so you can see the most questions possible on the FAFSA um, here, but it will ask the student to enter the number of children or other dependents who live with the student and will receive more than half of their support from the student between July 1st, 2026 and June 30th, 2027. Rhea has no other dependents, and Rhea is the only family member who's attending college next year. So we can leave this as 0, but this is just helpful for you all to see. And for dependent students, it will be asking this about their parent. So we'll click continue. As I just said, Rhea will be the only family member who's attending college. So we'll just enter 1 here. Next, it's moving over to the tax return information to get a little bit more information they can't automatically retrieve, asking about IRA, pension, scholarships, foreign income. So when we go back over to the case study, Rhea has no IRA or pension rollovers, no benefits reported as income to the IRS, and no foreign earned income exclusion. They do have a job making $10,000 annually and file taxes. So for these ones where Rhea doesn't have an IRA rollover, doesn't have a pension rollover, hasn't received any of these scholarships or grants reported as income, and doesn't have any foreign earned income inclusion, we'll just enter 0 for each of those. No child support received. And then moving into assets. Rhea has about $200 in their checking account and $150 in their savings. So for total cash and savings and checking accounts, we'll add those two together. Rhea has $350. For current net worth of investments, including real estate, important here is that it doesn't include this home the student lives in. This would be if they own real estate for maybe like a second home or something like that. On these questions, there are info icons that pop that are available on the live FAFSA that have extremely helpful information, particularly when families do have questions about these sections and making sure they're entering things accurately. I'd encourage them to start by clicking those info icons. A lot of questions get answered by just reviewing that information. No business or investment form for Rhea either. So we'll click continue. And that completes the finances section. And so next we'll move into selecting colleges and career schools that Rhea is interested in attending. And this is where the FAFSA information gets sent to. So we'll go ahead and click continue. This just gives some basic information, tips for searching for schools, but the student should select at least one college or um, career school that they want to send their information to. They can select up to 20 of them. And if a student selects 20 of them or selects three of them and realizes they need to adjust this after the form's been completed and processed, they'll just submit a correction to adjust this. Um, so we'll start by entering the information from the case study about the potential colleges. We'll enter Utah as the state, and we're looking for Barnard College and McLester. So we'll select uh, any of the cities. And if students want to see like a full list of Utah schools, they can select this. Again, this is a limitation of the case study where only a few of them are going to be popping up. So we'll select the two schools that are listed on here. And then we'll click continue. On this next page, it gives them a reminder that they'll want to be selecting at least one in-state Utah college if they want to be eligible for in-state grants. But the order that they're listing their colleges in doesn't matter for purposes of the state aid information here in Utah. But students can make sure they've selected all of the colleges that they want. They can remove any if they accidentally selected one and changed their mind. They can also click view more information. It'll bring them to a page that gives them more information about the college itself. To try and help them make sure they're making an informed decision. They can also search and select more schools if they've decided that they forgot one. So Rhea has these two schools. They click continue and then they're at the end. So it gives them a chance to review all of the information that's been entered into the form. And we encourage all students to review all of that. If they notice that something isn't correct, they'll be able to follow the direct link to that question and it'll bring them back in the FAFSA to that question so they can adjust it. We'll click continue here as Rhea will say has reviewed all of the information. Um, And then it just goes to the sign and submit page. So it helps the student understand what they're submitting and electronically signing. Gives them lots of information, making sure they're entering everything accurately. Once the student has reviewed all of the terms above, they can check the box, agree, and then click sign and submit. And at this point, the student has completed the form because they were deemed an independent student. Stay on this page. There isn't additional steps that have to be taken. They don't have to wait for a contributor to complete their piece. This gives them their completion date and an estimated student aid index populates for them. It gives them an estimate of their Pell Grant that they may be eligible for. But again, just a reminder, this is all estimates and the final information is shared after it's processed and then by the institution. Gives next steps for the student to review as far as checking their email for any updates in the confirmation page. They'll also get an update when in 1 to 3 days when the form's been processed and sent to the schools that they listed on their form. They'll be able to, at that point, be able to review their FAFSA summary page as well or make any corrections that's necessary. And they'll a note here that they'll receive communication from their school about the information collected on the FAFSA. Regarding the student aid index, any other steps that might be required, or the availability of financial aid to the student. So back over to the case study. The guardian information is shared here, but as we discussed, the guardian information isn't required for the grandparent because the student has legal guardians. They're not required to be completing the FAFSA. Their information isn't needed for the FAFSA, in fact. And so we don't need that information. We can follow through the scenarios of making a correction on an application. I'll go back over to the different scenarios. So we'll scroll down to the correction application and we'll select, let's see, it's the third one, where the dependent student income taxes paid is greater than or equal to the AGI number. So the student, after they've submitted in this scenario, we're going to say gets an error and a correction is required on their FAFSA. So this will appear in their My Account Activity section, and they'll have to go back in and make a correction. And you can see when a student logs into their account, this is what happens. They'll see this My Activity section and this note that action is required. So they'll go ahead and select the FAFSA form, move over into this section, and we can see that the FAFSA form is processed, but the action is required. So it gives them the link here to start the correction, gives them some more information about what it means to go through the corrections process. So they'll click continue. And it gives some information about the errors that are listed here that they have to go in and correct. So if we're going back to the case study in this scenario, this is the details that we're going to use. So it says that the student's adjusted gross income should be $10,000 and that tax paid is $1,000. So we'll go back into here, adjust their AGI to be $10,000 and adjust their income tax paid to be $1,000. They'll click continue. They've made all the corrections that are necessary on the form and they'll click continue again. The same sign and submit form that gives them that information about the terms they're agreeing to. The student agrees and they again sign and submit the form. So this is just an adjustment to their FAFSA that happens. The same information pops up for them. We'll stay on this page again, but that would be how the corrections process works for a student who maybe has an error after they've completed their form and that additional action is required. There's similar information if you want to follow on the other correction options there, where they can adjust the schools that they sent the FAFSA form to. I feel like that's a pretty common scenario that students face after they've completed the FAFSA. Back over to the case study, we've got about 20 minutes left in our hour we have planned. So if we wrap up early, that's okay with me. And I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions you all have. But I do want to point out that if there is a student or parent that has to manually insert their taxes, this is a reminder that they need their 2024 tax information. This link directly from FSA is information about how to find the tax information from the 2024 taxes. It walks them through where to find all of the information on their 1040s. So this is really helpful if you have a family that is needing to manually enter information. It also has a link for foreign tax filers as well. So I am going to move into a discussion prompt. I encourage, like I said, active engagement. Oh, go ahead, Ash.
I was just going to say there's a question in the chat about independent students and family size.
Yeah,
Um, I think either if you wanted to address it or just quickly chat about that.
yeah. So if the student was independent, the question about change in family size is only to the student dependents, not the student's family they live with. That is correct. And so that's what the on the prototype, the wording changes slightly if it's an independent student and it asks about dependents of the student completing the form. If it's a dependent student, then it's asking about dependents in of their parent. And so the wording changes slightly on the question in the FAFSA, but that is correct. It's asking about the family size of the dependent student. So an example of why it may ask that is dependent students, or excuse me, independent students may be a student parent who has children of their own. That is potentially more applicable to adult students who are returning to education, maybe less common among high school students, but that would be why that question is in there. So good question. And thanks for bringing that up, Ashley. Okay, so let's move into the discussion prompt and get a little bit more familiar with legal guardianship. So Rhea is asked if their grandparent have court order papers showing their legal guardianship over Rhea. 2 weeks later, Rhea returns with the paperwork that shows their parents don't have legal guardianship, but they have custody. So as we discussed earlier, it's important to note the custody versus legal guardianship that appears on the paper. It's an important distinction in terms here. So this is something to review. Does this change the student's situation? So this is information directly from FSA. To determine legal guardianship means to determine your dependency status, the FAFSA form asks to check a group of boxes with different situations, and one states the student is or was in a legal guardianship with someone other than their parent or step-parent as determined by the court in their state of residence. Many students incorrectly answer yes here, and for this question, the definition of legal guardianship does not include custody agreements, even if they were appointed by the court to be your guardians, and you cannot be your own guardian. So, um, does that change the student situation? It is a little bit earlier today, so I'll give you all the benefit of the doubt. But the answer, as we discussed, is yes. Custody is not the same as legal guardianship, so it does change the status, the situation for this student, and what it means for Rhea and how to go about completing the FAFSA. They should go back into the FAFSA and submit a correction. In this scenario, they would remove that answer to the question that about legal guardianship and select none that apply. In that case, it will make the student dependent for purposes of the FAFSA, and they'll answer a few other questions. In this scenario, there may be other circumstances, and well, the student's parent, legal parent, would be required to provide information for the FAFSA here, where we read the student may have difficulty being in contact with their parent due to them being incarcerated. That may be a case where a different circumstance would apply, where they may be able to be deemed independent because they don't have access to their parents' information, which is a little bit of a different circumstance than this one that we've gone through today. So there might be some other remedies for a student who is in a difficult circumstance, who doesn't have access to their parent, different than a parent who is not willing to provide their information. So just to go over the review, the case study offered a practice to help hopefully help you all practice for a potential independent student. As Rhea currently lives with her grandparents, we thought the initial case study was about helping an independent student, but after reading more in the discussion prompt, we learned that Rhea's situation might be considered more of an unusual circumstance, which is the other list of questions that would pop up for a student about being able to provide parent information. So in the dependency questions, there would be a box that says the student is or was in legal guardianship with someone other than the parent or step parent as determined by the court in their state of residence. That makes the student independent, as we talked about, and they don't need to provide their information. But the key difference is making sure that folks are carefully reviewing the court documentation to see if it's legal guardianship or custody that's been granted. Although the information for Rhea's guardians is available in this case study, it's not used in Rhea's application since they are considered an independent for purposes of the FAFSA. However, in the discussion prompt, when we learned that Rhea's grandparents don't have legal guardianship, they just have custody. Therefore, we wouldn't select that box asking if the student has a legal guardianship, asking if someone has a legal guardianship of the student. We'd need to review the information about Rhea's biological parents. And like I mentioned before, since Rhea's father is in prison and their mother passed away, the situation would most likely be considered an unusual circumstance where they would be selecting no to all of the dependency questions, but there would be the other set of questions of unusual circumstances, and they would likely select yes there, which would make them provisionally independent, which means that they'll likely be selected for verification by their college and need to follow up with them to qualify for any aid from the FAFSA, providing additional documentation. Um, and so once that gets updated on the form, Rhea would be able to complete the rest of the form, sign and submit the FAFSA, and continue from there. So that was a lot of information. I know that situations, particularly those around dependency or unusual circumstances, can be kind of tricky to answer. There's a lot of really sensitive information that we're asking, not only for purposes of the FAFSA generally, but particularly in some of these situations. So always a good reminder, and I'm not sure anyone here particularly needs it, but always a good reminder to make sure that we're being sensitive to the family and student. Um, Maybe if you're in an open room at a FAFSA event and the student you're sensing is uncomfortable sharing this information, finding another time to meet with them one-on-one, or maybe a little bit of a quieter space so that the student is a little bit more comfortable sharing so that they can be able to access financial aid that they're able to qualify for. From that, though, we've got, like I said, about 15 minutes before the hour is up. Happy to answer any questions about this case study or other FAFSA questions anyone has.
Yeah, I've got a question. It's not about this specific case study, but it's
Okay.
about a student that I'm currently working with and trying to help her with FAFSA.
Do you mind if we cover any case study related questions first, and then I'll just pause the recording so we don't get the student specific information?
Hmm.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions about the current case study? Otherwise, I'll go ahead and pause the recording.
Holly, do you want to try to? Oh, yeah, I can see you now. And it looks like maybe you are trying to talk. She just messaged me saying that she was trying to come off mute, but we couldn't hear her. So I'm sorry. I can see you trying to talk to us. If you share your question or comment in the chat, I'm happy to share with the group as well.
While Holly's typing her question up, and thanks for doing that. Are there any other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure where my mic was. So if I'm following correctly, the issue here was that she initially marked herself as an independent student and needed to mark herself as a dependent student despite not living with her parents.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily who they're living with that determines dependency. For this case, it was that distinction between legal guardian and having custody of the student. If the student is living with someone who they have court documentation that they are legal guardians of that student, then they can select yes to that question that we selected yes to when we went through the case study. If afterwards or during you find out that it's actually custody that the a custody situation that's been appointed by the court, the student wouldn't select yes to that set of questions we went through. There's a different set, and I can get them pulled up here, of deemed unusual circumstances um, that the student would likely be able to select yes to in this information. Here, let me share my screen really quickly.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the distinction is between guardianship and custody, and they
Yeah.
aren't.
Yep, exactly. And I think it's one that we see gets mixed up a lot for students and for families. I think for them, there isn't a huge distinction. The legal definition, there are distinctly different and important. And so if the student selects no to all of those dependency questions that we went through, rather than selecting yes to the guardianship, there's another set of questions that pops up about unusual circumstances and the parent cannot provide their information. One of those that they are able to select that this applies to them is if they or their parent are incarcerated. And so in this case, where the student's remaining parent, living parent is incarcerated, they'd be able to select yes to this. They'd still ultimately likely be, they'd be deemed provisionally independent and have to provide a bit more information to their college about their parent situation and being unable to provide their um, information. So ultimately, it ends up being the same scenario. The student doesn't have to provide parent information in this case because the parent's incarcerated. But there are some other circumstances where maybe their parent is living abroad and it's more difficult to get their information to them. But if none of these scenarios apply, then they would need to have their legal guardian providing information for purposes of FAFSA. Got it. And so, Holly, great question. The main distinction, the background information, the idea of this scenario is a lot of times we're helping students who give you information to the best of their ability, right? And so the student initially shared that they have legal guardians, that their grandparents are their legal guardians, and so we answer the FAFSA questions accordingly. However, when they go back and maybe check with their grandparents or double check that court documentation, that's when we learn that it's actually a custody situation, not legal guardians. And so that is why there's a change there at the end of the case study is the student realizes that they had mistaken that relationship that was appointed by the court.
Is there like a definition for estrangement, or is that kind of more of a circumstantial thing? Because like I'm just wondering if like not wanting to talk to or having a hostile relationship with a parent is enough to be qualified for estrangement, or if there needs to be like a documented amount of like abuse or
That's a great question. And most of these scenarios where a student is providing or answering that they have an unusual circumstance, they're deemed provisionally independent and they do have to provide additional documentation. So we could do some more searching of what exactly that means. It is a little bit more flexible, where the student is selecting what is they feel the most accurate representation of their situation. However, like you said, I think it's more likely that it would be that they'd have to be providing some sort of documentation or some additional information, not just that maybe the parent isn't willing to share their information. There's also some more, and I will put this link in the chat if I didn't. Oh, I did put it in there. Because if you scroll down a little bit further, if none of the unusual circumstances apply and you don't meet the other criteria for an independent student, you must provide parent information on your FAFSA, even if you don't live with your parents, your parent isn't paying for college, and your parent doesn't claim you as a dependent on their taxes. So there's a little bit more information there. But I think in a case where a student is maybe unsure, reaching out to a financial aid office too for the college they're planning to attend to understand what other documentation might be required. If they're answering that question, yes, would be helpful too, so they can understand if that would be a situation that would be able to be approved as an independent student or not for the FAFSA. We don't mean to cause any confusion. I do think that in the field, though, we see this a lot, right? Students and families trying to give the best information they can on this form that's not only has a lot of information and questions that I think can be a little bit overwhelming or scary to think of answering, but also this impact on their financial aid. So this is a really great conversation, and I appreciate it. And Holly, just I'm seeing your question in the chat. Does that mean a parent in prison could still be the legal guardian with a different relative currently has custody? That's correct. Any other questions related to this case study? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining. I'm going to go ahead and pause.